Welcome into the Living Room Disciple Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Rebekah Mui and Marissa Burt for a conversation on Christian parenting. We're passionate around here about being formed to look like Jesus, but Rebekah and Marissa warn us that a lot of the tools and strategies that have been given to Christian parents are actually forming parents and children away from the way of Jesus and hurting our families and our faith in the process. But there's a better way. So I'm so glad you've joined us for today's episode. Marissa Burt is currently co-writing In the Way They Should Go, a book on the history, theology, and impact of popular Christian parenting teaching, which we will talk all about today. She holds an MA in theology and co-hosts the At Home with the Lectionary podcast with her husband, Father Aaron Burt. Rebekah Mui is a PhD student studying post-colonial political theology at Virginia Tech. She's a writer and the editor of the Kingdom Outpost. So let's jump into today's episode of the Living Room Disciple Podcast, where discipleship finds a home. Well, welcome into the Living Room Disciple Podcast. I am so grateful to be joined today by Marissa Burt and Rebekah Mui. Today we are going to be talking about parenting and specifically some areas of Christian parenting teaching. And I am stoked about today because it's a little bit of a unique episode. So if I'm understanding this correctly, Marissa and Rebekah, you guys have actually never met in person, right?
Correct.
So this is an online digital conversation because y'all were interacting online on social media and basically said it would be great if we could actually talk about this on a podcast sometime. And here we are. And so I'm super excited to just kind of see where this conversation goes. Oftentimes we have a book that I've already read that I'm going to ask questions about or something, but today's going to be a little bit more of just kind of sitting around a coffee shop having a conversation. But digitally, right? And so super excited to hear both of your wisdom and also share it with our listeners. So why don't we get started by telling us a little bit about who y'all are? So Marissa, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much for having us. I'm excited for this conversation. My name's Marissa. I am an author and writer. I'm currently working on a book about that really traces the history of popular Christian parenting teaching and examines the theological assumptions and some of the impact of those teachings. I'm working on it with a co-author, my co-author, Kelsey Kramer McGinnis. And what else? I'm married to an Anglican priest, have been many years in church planting and parish ministry, mother to 6 children, and I live out in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle area.
I did not know you had 6 children. That definitely colors a little bit of our conversation today.
Yeah, that's awesome. I go to Virginia Tech and I research Christianity, political theology, and empire. Primarily what I've been looking at thus far has been gender and how the process of creating these relationships of like authority and submission and control are closely intertwined with the household as a concept, with slavery, with Roman patriarchy. And so I mostly looked at sort of, you're talking about like the Ephesians household codes. I mostly looked at sort of the husband and wife passages and the slavery sections of it as opposed to the parenting aspects. But I mean, it kind of overlaps in terms of theology. And I also have read some of the sort of more fundamentalist versions of the parenting books that Marissa talks about. I can identify a lot with what she discusses. I feel like the themes are very similar. And so coming from sort of a homeschool background, you're exposed to a lot.
For sure.
Yeah, so Marissa, you are working on a book project, and I think it would actually be a great starting point for this conversation for you to just tell us a little bit about what that research is about and what you're hoping to accomplish with that book.
Sure. Oh, a lot. I'll try and keep it limited. Well, probably by the time this comes out, there will be more public details about the book deal itself, but it's tentatively titled, and I think the title encapsulates a lot. in the way they should go, how the Christian parenting empire shaped a generation of evangelicals, and where we go from here. And so it's really focusing in on, we use the terminology popular Christian parenting teaching. So everything really from Dobson, who was kind of the pioneer of this approach to Christian parenting and really demarcating it from maybe secular conversations about parenting to something that was going to happen really primarily within evangelicalism. But it included people like Ezzo. It included people like Ted Tripp. I'm working through a deep dive on shepherding a child's heart right now. It included certain circles like maybe Bill Gothard, Vision Forum, these kind of different dominionist subcultures. Many of them held disparate theological positions, but really had a lot of overlap with their family life teaching. And I think a lot of that maybe has to do with what Rebekah was mentioning earlier, the kind of hierarchical structure, a lot of the components we see of, oh gosh, there's so much, like which thread you pull on, reactionary movements to things going on in society and culture. So things like inerrancy, complementarianism, these sort of conversations are trickling in and cultivating whole new streams that then are being offered up to parents. And one reason I think it's worth critically examining these things is not to say that there's nothing of merit in any of these teachings, or that there weren't understandable reasons why parents, new parents, often new converts, are looking for Christian principles to implement in their parenting, but to really say, what here aligned with the way of Jesus? What here aligns with the teaching and ministry of Jesus? Because much of this was simply presented wholesale as God's way, with, when you really get into it, very little substantiation, often very little even attempt at biblical support. It was to, in a large part, in many cases, people offering their parenting opinions and naming it God's way. And, that has impact. It's had impact on countless families. It was spiritually formative for a lot of people. And so, I think there are a lot of young adults, people who are now maybe parents themselves, or who, for whatever reason, are reflecting back on their experience as children, examining these things. I think, pastorally speaking, I see multiple generations reckoning with this. I see older parents reckoning with the impact, saying, why is it that my adult children don't want relationship with me? Why have we lost ability to have conversation? What has gone wrong? Because all these promises were made. And in our work, we often call them prosperity gospel parenting promises. All these promises were made that it would work out well. So there's a lot to explore. The hope would be that it would really offer some shared vocabulary. It would really shine a spotlight on a lot of these things. It would help individuals and families name these things. And not Kelsey and my co-author and our goal is not to offer a new right way or a prescriptive parenting approach, but to sort of say, how do we maybe offer families a way forward to have a conversation about this? How do we offer a new generation of parents a way forward to think differently about these things? Because it can be a little unmooring, if you're not, if you don't want to adopt maybe what was offered to you as a child, but where do you go from there? So lots to explore. And I'm so drawn to so many of Rebekah's threads. I remember when I first got on Twitter a couple years ago, seeing I want to know about Kingdom Outpost as the name you've chosen, but just so many of these threads are really exploring this concept of empire and authority and how it does or doesn't, as often the case, align with the way of Jesus. So I'd love to hear about that in particular, because the terminology there really grabbed me, of Kingdom Outpost.
Yeah, the word kingdom comes from the sort of anarcho-pacifist or Anabaptist world of political theology, where the kingdom of God is seen as breaking into the world and really doing like Christ initiating on the cross, something that's very different from the hierarchy and control and violence of the Roman world. And so Jesus is on the cross, suffering Roman violence in contrast to Rome using this violence to gain more power, essentially. And so this image of the crucified Christ really becomes central to political theology and just sort of like who we are to be in this world. I really love that you mentioned sort of this whole spectrum, because I think the funny thing for me coming out of a more conservative Christian world is realizing that the mainstream evangelical world is just basically the same concept, just maybe not as niche in terms of like not everybody dresses like the Duggars, but people can wear pants and still be preaching the same authoritarianism.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Different garb, but the same heart, and maybe different groups being a little more scrupulous with it, but it's the same heartbeat, right?
Yeah, and that heartbeat, like if we zoom out a little bit and look at sort of the larger issue of like Christianity in America, Christianity in the world, what is at the core of it is this idea that somehow, because of the sexual revolution, because of like post 1950, the Christianity, the world has gone out of whack. America's gone out of whack. And then it was really great before. There's this kind of like rose colored glass kind of looking back at the past as being some sort of ideal. And now basically what parents are trying to do to their children is kind of beat America back in shape by using parenting, by creating this generation of sort of reverse progressive kids. That's what the Duggars tried to do. Like they're trying to move away from what they grew up as and like create this weird subculture of kids who live in this world of authority and submission and order. And like Whitehead and Perry in their book about Christian nationalism, I think it's called Taking America Back for God, they talk about this concept of like, and it's a very, very mistaken concept because like sexual violences, sexual immorality and abuse were rampant in the systems of the past, in the colonial patriarchal systems. But the idea somehow is that the only evils there are primarily post 1960s. Anything like feminism, anything that came after the perfect patriarchal period is terrible, and we need to like use children as a way to take America back for God and take the world back for God. Because God lives in the 1950s, right?
Right. Well, and you actually see that exact rhetoric. I mean, they're not hiding that. They're not, so they're very direct. Like even reading Tripp's introduction a few weeks ago, they're very clear that there's a belief, and I think you're right, it's a mistaken belief, but a belief that there was a very specific way that was working for everyone. And then it got derailed somehow. And we just need to get back to that. And it's very much wrapped into a proper submission to authority and a proper hierarchical system. And I think, there's some ignorance there maybe of reality. I think there's privilege in that maybe it worked for certain people in certain ways. And for others, it's never worked. It's never been a good system. And so there's a lot that feeds into them. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, Rebekah, because you mentioned your primary area of study is in the marriage household dynamic. Kelsey and I have been kind of doing a deep dive on the way the tradwife trends are intersecting with Christian influencer content, because it's kind of very much wrapped up in the aesthetics, the idealized aesthetics of the 1950s. I mean, not even, again, none of this is particularly historically accurate, but it's presenting an aspirational vision, right? Like, so what are your thoughts on all of that as you evaluate that?
I mean, most of it is not even disguised at all, but a lot of it is thinly disguised white supremacy. That's honestly just it. Like the world before the corrupting social influences of rock music. Where does rock music supposedly come from? Asia and Africa. It's supposed to come from so-called demonic cultures. And so, I mean, this was something more of a Gothard and an IFB kind of, what do you call it? The I was gonna say the drum they beat, but that can't. They're against the
They
drum.
outrightly said that, I think, right? They said that, yeah.
But any kind of like cultural influence, any kind of music that isn't from a strictly fundamentalist European tradition. I also had a thought when you were saying that, which is that it's the entire parenting structure that we're looking at in books like Trips, for example, or Dobson. The idea of this spending one-on-one time with your children, for example, as a stay-at-home mom, just like nurturing them constantly and interacting with them is actually an entirely new concept from like the 1980s. So sociologist Sharon Hayes has written about intensive mothering and how it came about because women were going to the workforce, and so they had to overcompensate. And so this ideal of this mother who just sits on the floor and plays with her children was invented then. And I see evangelicals taking up this ideal and making that into like, this is how it's always been. But if you look historically, parents, like if you talk to people who parented in the 1950s, they're like, put the baby in the cot, kick the other kids out of the house, and get on with your housework. Like they did not spend that much time with their children. The time that parents spend with their children has statistically increased in the last few decades. So like even the kind of relationship, even the very conception of childhood feels it is statistically, sociologically entirely new. And so I'm curious if you have kind of seen this thing where there's this assumption that it's always been this way, and that like parents, especially mothers, have to spend inordinate amounts of time with their children.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I think it is very much, I mean, so many of these things overlap, but the same way you hear instructions for like being a primary stay-at-home mom, this is really something that's only been available to wealthy, predominantly white women in recent years, right? Like always, both adults were typically working in some capacity, right? Like everyone's working. The adults are working, particularly in subsistence cultures. There's not this leisure to consider this. So I think those kind of myths just creep in uncritically because it's presented as godly. Now, no, I am primarily home with my children, so I'm not trying to say this isn't again that there aren't desirable things about a variety of these things. I think it's great to be able to spend more focused time with children than maybe families have been able to in the past. Similarly, there are flaws with Dobson's teaching. However, he became pivotal for fathers being more present in family life and for parents. So there are threads here of like, oh, this is redemptive. This is good. Sometimes there was a desire to course correct a gap or something that maybe needed bolstering. But I think the reliance on authority language to do that is really problematic, whether it's spiritual authority, like, well, this is God's best, or what God wants for your family, or the making one's own experience normative for everyone, kind of in a superior way. Like, because I did this, everyone should do this. Or because I'm able to do this, everyone should do this. And if you don't, that's a problem. And I think when you pair this, particularly for mothers, and particularly in conservative Christian spaces, with complementarian rhetoric, you have a lot of women's creative capacity and intellect funneled to the domestic sphere. Like that is the permissible domain. So I think it becomes really understandable that there's a redefinition of the meaning of that, right? So whether that's things like the tradwife movement, that the domestic arts, which maybe would have been one of many outlets for work and creativity, become the only one. And motherhood becomes the highest calling, to the exclusion of any other vocation a woman has, which of course marginalizes people who aren't mothers, people who want to be mothers and cannot be for whatever reason, or even women who are mothers beyond their childbearing years. It really spotlights in this very narrow sliver. So again, it's maybe a distorted emphasis that conveniently pairs very well with the teaching that is across the board in other ways, the complementarian teaching. And I see this a lot in the vocabulary used. Like, we're putting everything under the microscope at work, right? So I'm sure people following along are kind of like, oh my goodness, taking it all so seriously. But I do think so much becomes communicated with the rhetoric that is used, words meant to encourage mothers that are maybe struggling with the mundane reality of domestic work with very young children, or the challenges of that. There are good encouraging words that are, the intent I think is admirable, but kind of elevating these things to, you are holding the nation together, in dominionist theology, or you are preserving the family, which is preserving the future. And I'm using kind of hyperbolic terms, but kind of not. Like, if you go into dominionist teaching, theonomist teaching in particular, they use these phrases for family life. And I think it can be a kind of indoctrination to keep people maybe content in that, because it is hard. It is hard to be alone. It's hard. It can be lonely. Like you mentioned, the example of a woman all of a sudden giving focused time at home. And if a woman's told, God does not permit you to work outside the home, you got to find a way to psychologically find contentment with that. And so sometimes that can be done by saying, well, but it's very, very meaningful that I sacrifice in this way. So I don't know. It gets complicated because I think there are different theological traditions in the church that hold to different beliefs. I mean, I'm curious to hear about, you mentioned Anabaptist or Mennonite is your background.
No, that wouldn't be my background. That would be sort of the community that I engage with, and sort of like the work that I do is situated very much in the political
so how
theology.
Do you see, like, for instance, do you see that playing out in different denominations in different ways? When you think of family life teaching, the role of women, how this impacts their vocational work?
I'm seeing a lot of similarities. It's almost as if conservative Christians in America tend to revert to some idealized historical norm. It would depend on the group how well they are able to sustain that kind of sociology. Like, it's a gendered sociology.
Mm-hmm.
And how well they're able to sustain it depends on the communities. So like Anabaptist communities definitely have held to, and maybe like they held on to things like family farms in the face of industrialization. That's why some groups are so really suspicious of technology, because they see that as social disintegration. It's disintegration of certain economic and also social and familial way of life, I guess. One thought I have is that, listening to what you're saying, I totally agree that it's like nurturing isn't a bad thing. Nurturing is a new concept. That's what I'm saying, and that we can't like look at the past to get an idea of nurturing, because there were certain things, like, for example, you talked about women with leisure time. Women lived with leisure time back in the 1920s, even did not raise their own children. The idea.
That's a great point.
Yeah. Or even children with disabilities, there was no concept of parenting. They were sent away to institutions. So a lot of what we consider good parenting and nurturing today is relatively new. And so what we have in evangelicalism is this kind of amalgamation of a lot of new ideas together with a kind of idealization of a certain authoritarian order, I think. And that kind of forms a prescriptive ideal that is impossible to live up to. Like, nurturing is not a bad thing. The thing is that the standard of nurturing for women in particular is that basically you have to almost die to be a good mother. You have to, it's a sociological thing recent in American history, that good mothering requires sacrifice to the extent that you lose yourself in the process. And then,
yeah.
The
and
rhetoric,
it's such the rhetoric. I was going to say it's such a treadmill, and then you combine that with spiritual rhetoric about death to self and consider someone other, the others more important than yourself, and choosing joy, and all of this spiritual rhetoric, which is good. It's biblical, but can be a kind of unending self martyrdom that really begins to say any self at all is selfish. Right? I mean, I see you writing sometimes on that thread. Do you have thoughts on that, on those topics?
Yeah, I really thinking through it because I come from sort of Wesleyan background, where to me, growing up, these would have been good things because they're at least some kind of bastion of defense against sort of things like prosperity gospel and just a kind of me type of Christianity. So I would have been like a huge fan of like Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship, where he's like, yeah, Christ calls you to take up your cross. And all this is good, but I think the context in which we are idealizing sort of a death culture and a relationship with God that is fundamentally, like, I guess this is kind of pushing to one of the questions we were going to discuss, but like how we view God. Because like we can take up a cross and follow him, but who is he that we are following? Is he like Caesar or is he like Christ? And what we imagine God to be can be this thing in our minds that really becomes self-destructive. Like, we think the hardest road is the most Christian road. We think the most misery, God is teaching me something in this. God is building my character. Or, this loss, this grief is designed by God to. And so we put the worst possible interpretation of God on events and on life and on service. That, I think it's basically like an internalized self-flagellation and isn't very much different from like self-flagellation in some, the medieval Christianity.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, so much. It makes me think of the parable of the servants who bury their talents, and the last one who when he buries, or the three, they're entrusted talents, only the one buries. The others make more talents, but the one who buries it comes back to the master and kind of throws it back at him and says, "You're harsh and cruel." And that's why I buried it. And I think of this whenever I read a lot of the teaching, because I do think it reveals so much of what we believe about God and what we're teaching our children God is like. And thinking about this a lot lately, reading Tripp's, earlier was reading some of Doug Wilson's parenting teaching, and also some of the Vision Forum stuff. That's what I've been reading a lot of this fall. And thinking about, again and again, there's kind of a disapproving parental figure that is swift to punish, demands instant compliance and obedience, regardless of unquestioning, regardless of how you're feeling, defines your motivations entirely in terms of sin, kind of requires atonement for that, which is antithetical to the gospel of grace we preach, but kind of requires that from children via kind of swift corporal punishment. Often Christians are still firmly advocating for this, that God mandates corporal punishment, which is something I reject. I don't think that's exegetically or hermeneutically supportable, but it's very much still common in Christian parenting teaching. And I think parents feel guilty if they question that. They feel like they're, failing their children if they don't. So all of these things combine, and it gets really mixed up with a lot of Christianese as well. Tripp writes about this a lot. There's just word salads that are being offered up to parents to tell their children, like discipline should be about bringing your children before the cross of Christ and forgiveness, and many of these terms that are uh, no consideration for a child's spiritual development or their capacity to understand and directly connect with God. And instead, kind of this flood of cognitive doctrine being told to children at age 2, 3, 5, 8, that who knows what they're registering, but they're hearing these things over and over again. And what they're receiving is a confusing mixture of you're expected to comply. It's bad if you don't. You're punished, but that's forgiveness and grace somehow. And you do need to try harder. There's a greater standard. So when you really begin to parse out what's this messaging, man, it lands like a heavy weight. And I think I was talking to my husband about this. He gets an earful of this because I'm always like processing what I'm reading. So I was thinking, it makes me think of that passage when Jesus says, which of you being good would give your child something evil? And it makes me think we are often harming our children and then trying to tell them it's good and that is what God is like, that he is one who harms. He is one who disapproves of them. He is one who hates their sin. Their behavior has made him sad. I mean, all these sorts of, so we're kind of almost inverting a picture of God who is gracious, who is generous, who is slow to anger, who is compassionate, who's quick to forgive, who's abounding in loving kindness, to Jesus, who, when he interacted with children, took them in his arms and blessed them. And I think of that all the time. I think, does our spiritual instruction land like a blessing on children? Does it respect their ability to connect with Christ directly? I mean, even in that picture, the parents are bringing children to Jesus, yes, but they're not mediating, and so often the teaching is putting parents in a position. Really, I make a case for this a lot when I'm digesting this teaching on Instagram and kind of unpacking it, really in an idolatrous position and requiring parents to act as mediator, as Holy Spirit that diagnoses the sin in their children's lives, as a mediator that somehow atones for their sin via punishment, and really as a godlike agent of authority. And so I don't think Christian parents are intending that at all. I think most Christian parents who pick up popular Christian parenting teaching are overwhelmed, are devout and sincere and looking for help, are being told that's what God wants, and are doing their best with it, which is why I think it's such a problem for it to remain
we need
unexamined.
to unravel that teaching. Yeah.
I think just it betrays families. It betrays the entire family.
My instinct would be that the majority of Christian parents have been reading material that is pretty consistent in establishing a certain kind of parental control and authority as the ideal. And this kind of thing is very difficult to create and to maintain. And so I don't think that's the reality in most Christian homes. The problem is that at the back of their minds, they're like, but that's the ideal. My kids should, I don't know if you're studying Michael and Debbie Pearl's book.
Oh. Yes.
My kids should drop something they're holding at the drop of their hat, if I say a code word, or if I so much as so there's this idea that you have your children trained with behavioral conditioning or whatever, that they're just perfect, docile, no objections, nothing on their mind, basically extremely passive, extremely domesticated pets. The reality, I don't think, is that most parents can do that that takes a tremendous amount of control to establish. Like in my own home, my parents would have read things like Dobson, and that Dobson in particular, I think, would have been very influential internationally. And then seeing things like Gothard's teaching in the church and being like, that's not how we operate. That's not who we are. We're like a very vocal family, and we say what's on our mind and we express ourselves. But then it's like, but you're not the good Christian ideal.
Yeah. And there's a lot of shame with that, because I mean, a couple things. Wow, what you just said sparks a lot of thoughts. I mean, first, I think we are really examining the teaching itself, because I do think different families mitigate it in different ways. I think it's kind of like complementarianism, right? There's a lot of functional egalitarian marriages that are holding to complementarianism, for instance. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of families who are digesting this material, who are maybe picking and choosing, who are thoughtfully, maybe, only using certain things, are mitigating it in some way. So, I mean, we can't really account for that, but we can say what is the teaching directively saying. I think also, as we see in marriages, high control authoritarian teaching attracts abusive people and enables and cultivates abuse. So when it's not mitigated, when it goes wrong, it goes horribly wrong. I mean, the Pearls book was To Train Up a Child, was implicated in the deaths of 3 children when these were being brought to court, saying, look, this contributed to the deaths of children. And so much of this teaching, there's no cap on it. It's very subjective how a parent determines, well, what was rebellion? Where does the discipline stop? And it can put children in very vulnerable situations and enable, if not directly cultivate, abuse. However, I think, there's a whole spectrum there. Like we hear some of those stories. We can look at the extreme teachings. I think a lot of families mitigated it differently and weren't here. But maybe we're, as a result, bearing kind of, as you described, kind of shame, feeling like, well, we're like C+ family, like we're not able to achieve these aspirational heights. And I think for a lot of families that did take the authoritarian route, the receipt, it didn't work for them either. The receipt just doesn't come due for a while, because
prosperity gospel fails, right?
It fails. You can maybe control young children, as we see even in the Duggar family, right? You can control children into their teens, but autonomy is a God-given birthright. Like he grants people their free will. Like adult children eventually get there. Often I think it's either when they leave home, maybe they enter a new relationship, they're around other families and see different ways of operating, or they have children of their own, which reframes everything. But often something will pull on this, and that is when I think there's a moment of reckoning, because so much of this teaching is grounded, like you said, Rebekah, in almost curating controlled behaviors, like top-down complete control. And so parents are given very little tools for navigating actual autonomy of another human being, that children aren't extensions of themselves, that they aren't theirs to control. So when an adult child finally recovers their autonomy, can the relationship sustain it? And a lot of that depends on whether the parents are willing to critically examine what they believed, how the promises betrayed them, how maybe their intentions did not equal the impact their children felt. And there's a lot of fragility around that, and a lot of defensiveness. Honestly, I see it mirrored what we see in church family systems, when people who've been injured in churches come forward and say, here's how it's hurt. You see a lot of the same patterns of like, you're the problem. You're estranged, you're on the outside, you're probably wanting to sin, whatever it is. And there's really a fundamental incapacity to listen. which I think is really understandable because families were never given those tools, right? Like a child's voice was silenced pretty early on in the most authoritarian system. So it's a very knotted up thing. I think it's very painful and very tender places. Like I try and walk that line of really examining critically the teaching while recognizing these are very tender places. There's already a lot of shame involved. The last thing I want to do is heap more shame on people. Really, the desire would be to free people up, to begin to let some light in on those places, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we can loop all the way back to the very beginning of our conversation and just talking about some of Rebekah's work being titled Kingdom Outpost, where I think as we are examining, maybe some of us are examining our childhood, some of us are examining the way that we parented and feel complicit in going with some of these teachings that maybe we regret. Some of us are wondering how we are going to create a better path forward, or how we're going to reconcile with a parent or a child. And there's a lot of wounds that have been created because we've been taught that Christianity is about control and not about following a savior who lays his life down. And I just think that, going back to the idea of Kingdom Outpost, that if we keep our eyes focused on the crucified Savior and remembering that Christ came to almost give away his dignity, give away his authority, in order to pull other people up. He came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And I think sometimes we act like in Galatians 5, like there's this addendum to the fruit of the Spirit where it says, unless you're dealing with children, then in that case you can act however you want to make them behave how you want them to behave. But when you're talking to adults, you need to act this way, right? And I was just thinking earlier about the passage where the disciples are rebuking the children who are coming to Jesus. And Jesus says, it would be better for you to have a millstone hung around your neck and be thrown into the sea than to stop these children from coming to me. And I think what's implicit there is you need to treat these children with the same amount of dignity as you would treat any adult, that they have access to me as well, that you should not stop them from coming to me just because they are a child. And so this is a podcast, and I said at the very beginning that this is a unique episode of this podcast because I just wanted to hear you guys talk, and it was a joy and an honor to hear all of your thoughts. But this is a podcast that really looks at how are we formed and shaped by the things that we are teaching and the things that we are taking in, the ways we are acting, the things we are saying. And I think whether you're a parent or a child or a new parent thinking about how your parents raised you, or wherever you find yourself in this dynamic, I think we should do a lot of thinking in terms of how we want to both be shaped as disciples of Christ, but how we want to shape our children as disciples of Christ, how we want to even have influence with our parents and siblings and families as disciples of Jesus Christ, the Christ who came and laid his life down as a ransom for many. So any closing thoughts? We do have to wrap up in a couple minutes here, but Marissa and Rebekah, any closing thoughts that you want to leave our listeners with?
I do. I mean, I love the name of the podcast because it is about discipleship. That's what we kind of have been discussing this whole time. One of the things that has occurred to me as I think through this subject is that a lot of times the focus is on creating a kind of like a subject. Like the focus is on using discipline to control outcomes. Whereas discipleship is really about bringing someone up to maturity. It's about the formation of that individual. And so for like in psychology, they call it, self-regulation, the ability to regulate your emotions and goals and things. And the thing that they found is like fear and punishment actually destroys a child's ability to develop self-regulation and probably has huge like long-term ramifications in terms of who they are as individuals. And so we can't have our wills broken. We need all of our will and determination and perseverance to be disciples and follow after Jesus. It's employing this regulation, this the strength, the will. That's what we're supposed to like love God with all our heart and soul and strength. Like this is an active thing. And so we need to develop that kind of maturity to be able to do that. And I think that needs to be the direction, sort of the conversation, the direction of the way we're looking at subjects like this, that it isn't about someone else like being the puppeteer. It's about coming into this maturity and like pursuing Christ, which takes a lot of determination and will.
Yeah. And setting our children up to know how to do the right thing when the time comes, even if they don't have you standing next to them, ready to tell them exactly what to do in that exact moment. How about you, Marissa? Any concluding thoughts that you'd like to leave people with?
So many things, right? But I love what you said about remembering that children are our littlest neighbors, that all the one anothering verses, all of these verses apply to children. I love this idea of remembering. I mean, we talked about how we parent shapes our view of God, what we receive as children, thinking that when that God drew near to us. I mean, the overarching narrative of Scripture shows God drawing ever nearer, and then incarnationally in Christ, and then indwelling us, and the tenderness of that. It makes me think of, I'm not sure which prophet, but when he's referring to the people of God in Israel's time in the wilderness, he talks about God leading them by the hand like a child. And I think of the tenderness of that image and the patience of God to again and again show his people through his word proclaimed, through the word Jesus, through his works, what he's like, to again and again show them his kindness, his loving kindness. This incarnational connected model, I think, would serve parents in particular so well, both as we kind of examine maybe the own tender spots we have, but as we think of what does it mean to disciple, as Rebekah used that terminology, what does it mean to show our children what a life of faith is like, this incarnational model, and what Jesus models is stooping to serve, as you said, Nick. So I think if there are parents listening, young parents, I would love to free you up to say there's tremendous freedom for the Christian to authentically follow Jesus and kind of let that ripple out in the unique culture of your family, in the unique children God has entrusted to your care for a short time. There's not a rigid performative thing to kind of like free yourself of that burden and that basket and look to the Lord who's saying, open your arms wide. I will fill them. That's Psalm 91, I think. But
yeah, that's beautiful. Man, I think it's obvious that we could talk for many hours on this subject. So we will have to have another conversation after your book comes out. That would be wonderful. But in the meantime, we would love to stay in contact online. So tell our listeners where they can find you. Marissa, why don't you go first?
Sure. You can find me on almost any social media platform. I went from not being on socials at all to everywhere. So at Burt Writes, or you can visit me on my website at marissaburt.com, and there's all the links there.
Perfect. And how about you, Rebekah?
I'm mostly active on Twitter. Whatever it's called now. I tried Threads and it's just not it's not a fit yet. I don't know. Mostly that and kingdomoutpost.org, and I have a personal Medium blog as well. I can put the links in the description.
Perfect. Yeah. I would love to encourage my listeners to go and follow both of you, because in case it wasn't clear from the last 47 and counting minutes, y'all are both a treasure trove of wisdom. So thank you for following Jesus, and thank you for inviting us into your journey as you follow Jesus. I think we're all better for it. So it's been a joy to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for joining us today. You can find the Kingdom Outpost at kingdomoutpost.org, as well as Rebekah's personal essays at medium.com/@Rebekah Mui. Mui is M-U-I. You can find more about Marissa at marissaburt.com as we await her new book. And as always, you can find us at livingroomdisciple.com, where you can support our work by becoming a Patreon supporter. We want to thank Anissa Leib for producing this episode, Eric Church for getting it to you, and Daniel Ramirez for composing the music on this episode of the Living Room Disciple Podcast, where discipleship finds a home.